My name is Naomi Eisenstadt. My current position is as Independent Advisor on Poverty to the Scottish Government, and I'm also an Honorary Research Fellow here at Oxford University. My mission has been better outcomes for children, but largely related to poverty and inequality and the disadvantage faced by children because of systemic reasons. The one that I always like to talk about in terms of my career is that my first job in Britain was in a social services day nursery in Edinburgh. I was a nursery assistant, so I was at the very, very bottom of the chain in terms of childcare workers. That's having had a degree in University of California, San Diego, which wasn't recognized in Britain. I worked in Milton Keynes for the Development Corporation, setting up a nursery and working on children's issues there. I worked at the Open University on parenting programs. I worked in the voluntary sector for a number of years, and my big job was I was the first director of the Sure Start program, and eventually was in charge of all early years policy, family policy, and extended schools for the Department for Education. I think that the Sutton Trust and Esme Fairbairn set up the Parenting Engagement Fund for two separate reasons. Esme Fairbairn, as a funder of the voluntary sector, was worried about the voluntary sector's inability to understand whether what they do actually works. So a lot of defensiveness. Of course it works, we're good people. Why wouldn't it work? All the parents love it, of course it works. The Sutton Trust was worried about whether it works or not, but was much more worried not from the organizational point of view, but from the actual intervention. What are they doing with mothers, fathers, and children? And does what they do work, as opposed to what's the nature of the organization, and how does the organization promote what works? So the two organizations, in my view, had slightly different aims in the project. One was to strengthen voluntary organizations and their abilities to understand evaluation. The other was to test out whether particular interventions work to improve particularly cognitive outcomes for young children, because the evidence so far has been very, very weak. It's enormously important to know whether things work, because we're expending a huge amount of effort, energy, and public money on a lot of interventions that don't work. And part of the problem with people in the public sector and the voluntary sector is that because you work so hard and because it's so hard to get the money to do the interventions, you have to believe it does. So what I was looking for in this project was how to instill in organizations something I call persistent curiosity. So if it is working, I want to tell people about it. But if it isn't working, I want to tell people about it, because I don't want to waste my time doing something that isn't working. When I ran a children's center in Milton Keynes many, many years ago, I did a lot of work on who was and wasn't coming to the center. And I did that. We were very busy, but I was worried that we weren't reaching the people who we needed to reach the most. Most people thought I was crazy because they kept saying, "But you're so busy, why aren't you satisfied?" Well, I wasn't satisfied because I felt there were people who these opportunities should have who weren't having it, because we were so busy with the people who found it easy to participate. So I've been interested in does it work from my own work for many, many years, and actually wound up doing a master's thesis on it. Well, you could say there's nothing more important. I mean, if you think particularly about the first 2 years, the relationships with mothers and fathers is the most important thing in developing babies and young children. And the way in which those relationships develop sets the tone for the rest of childhood and indeed the rest of adulthood. So it is enormously important, but I would argue, and I think some other questions are going to deal with this, but I need to say it again, that my interest has been, why is it harder for poor parents? And what are the things that can mitigate the difficulties that poor parents do in terms of their ability to raise happy, healthy children? There are several ways that poverty influences parenting. In the first instance, just stress. The example I always use is food, because people always blame poor people for giving their children a poor diet. And in my experience, and also there's some very good research to back this up, research from 30 years ago that Lorna McKee did in public health, is that women in poverty know exactly what their children should eat. But actually, fresh food is more expensive. Fresh food has more waste. If you don't have a car, you can't carry it home on the bus with the buggy. And the waste issue is particularly important for families living in poverty because you have to give your children what you know they're going to eat. So you will wind up giving them less healthy food because it's less of a hassle, but also because you can't afford to try a little. If you don't like it, we'll have something else and just have a bite of this Brussels sprout. It just doesn't work. When you're under stress over a range of other things, you will go for what looks like the easy option, but in those circumstances, so would I. Yeah, I mean, other examples of why living in poverty makes it much harder is my experience of people living in poverty is that the physical environment is very intimidating. People in poor housing have to cope with damp. They have to cope with dirt on the streets. When we did Sure Start, there's a wonderful example. When we did Sure Start, we had a test on whether they had actually spoken to parents when they were putting their plan together, because it was a requirement to speak to local parents. So the test was dog dirt. So if the plan came back and the plan said we spoke to local parents and they wanted more health visitors and speech therapists, we knew they spoke to health visitors and speech therapists. If the plan came back and they said we spoke to parents and they were worried about the dog dirt in the park where the children play, we knew they spoke to poor parents, because our experience was that families living in very poor housing, the thing that worries the most is the physical environment. And if you've ever been on those estates, the physical environment is very frightening. They're right to be worried about it. You would be too. I think the way that stress affects the parent-child, I think that poverty affects the parent-child relationship in quite complex and quite subtle ways. Now, this is Naomi talking, this isn't research, but this is what I observed and what I still believe over many, many years in working with families in poverty. Particularly for women, if you have no control over your life, if you're worried not about what's going to happen in 2 years, but worried what's going to happen at the end of the week, because how do you make the money last for food or for rent, or can I pay my electric? Then the things that you normally do, the power relationship over the child becomes very important because it's the only thing you have power over. So I remember, again, in the Children's Center in Milton Keynes, the baby would be crying in the pram and the mother would say, "He just wants picking up." Duh. Yes, that's what babies want, is to be picked up. But tiny babies, from the mother's point of view, were already exerting control that they refuse to be part of. So I'm not going to pick him up because he wants to be picked up. And I felt that that was a real feature in terms of people's self-confidence, people's sense of what do I have control over? The only thing I have control over is this baby. And of course you don't have control, it's the last thing you have control over. So I think there are ways in which the stress of being poor leads to behaviors that look very odd, but again, make complete sense in the environment. I think wiser heads than mine, like Kathy Silver, will tell you about the scientific features that make programs work. What I would say makes programs work is if it makes my life easier. So my joke about this is always, if you hold a parenting program in a free laundrette, I'm there. If I can do my washing at the same time, if there's benefits advice at the center, if there's housing advice the engagement has to be on the terms of what worries the parent as well as what we professionals want the parent to worry about. Government has spent many years, generations, wanting the electorate to want what they want them to want. And it doesn't happen that way. It really doesn't. So if you understand the context and the pressures on people's lives and can do anything to reduce those pressures, then in my experience, they are much more open to the engagement. Again, a line I always use when I give speeches is, just because they like it, it doesn't mean it works. But if they don't like it, they won't come and it's not going to work. So something that they like is enormously important. And my view on liking it is something that actually reduces pressure rather than increases pressure. Well, there are really funny examples from government where there have been arguments for years and years and years, and the Americans are still arguing about it, about should we have marriage incentives? Because the evidence shows that children from married parents do better. So should we punish parents who aren't married? or have incentives to get married. And as May Sherlock wisely said, well, how much would it cost? What would you have to pay me to get married? That's a nice example of a policy that's completely mad. So there's lots of, government level policy in terms of wanting to shift behavior that seems to me not to work. Certainly on the poverty side, in the health benefits argument, sanctions don't work. They are horrifically punishing. So I always think carrots are better than sticks in terms of what works and what doesn't work. So I think, but the other thing that I think is quite tough for government, for policy level decisions at government or at local government level, is that knowing what's the right thing to do doesn't necessarily mean we have the power to do it. So a really nice example is we have massive amount of evidence on the quality of workers in childcare settings. Having teachers in early year settings makes a massive difference. We know that. We've known that for years and years. The evidence piles up and piles up. There's no contradictory evidence, yet we don't do it because it's expensive. But it's simple to do. It's the easiest thing to do in terms of really shifting the curve on child outcomes, particularly on poor children if you concentrated that in poor areas. But we keep thinking we can get quality in some other way, and we can't. And we don't do it because it costs money. I think the only real innovation I've seen in the sector is EasyPeasy, is the app stuff, because it's using new technology and technology that people really, it links to the other comment I made about if they like it. It's technology that people enjoy using and feel really comfortable using. And the other interesting thing is that when I first heard about it, I thought, well, would everybody have a smartphone? And boy, was I wrong. Everybody has a smartphone. And the ubiquitous nature of smartphones is something that we didn't predict in terms of poverty. But it's just happened. It's just happened. So my guess is, in terms of the list on, when you have the essential items on, how do you measure what a minimum income standard should be, you would now include smartphones but not include landlines. Sorry, going back to innovation, I would say that we don't need more innovation. We have to use all the data that we already have, all the evidence we already have. We know loads and loads of things, but we continue. You see, I think parenting is really important, but it's the hardest thing to change. And we continue to try to find, the golden bullet on parenting, when in fact what we have to do is build the quality in our early years provision. And that would we know how to do it. We could do it really easily. It's not innovative. It just costs more money. I'm pretty depressed about the future of early years provision. I have to say that some of the progress we made, we haven't lost. And one of the things that I think is incredible in terms of progress is, I'm old now, so if we go back to 1997, only Labour had anything about early years in their manifesto at all for the election in 97. For the election subsequently, 2001, again, Labour had a lot about early years provision. The Conservatives had, well, Labour thinks women should go out to work and not be home looking after their children. That was 2001. That's shocking. So that wouldn't happen now. Now, no political party will go to the polls in the UK without clear policies on early years provision. That's a major success that we even talk about it. It's a major success that the Treasury is interested in. So we have made a huge amount of progress. And I feel really proud of that, along with many, many colleagues who have contributed to that. What I feel depressed about is what I said before, about not using what we already know and could use to make it better, and still being in the tension between, is childcare for labour market participation, or is it for improved child outcomes? Are we trying to have fewer poor children or ameliorate the impact of poverty on poor children and the next generation? I think we can do both, but we can't do both without significant investment, and politicians continue to believe that you can kill at least 3 birds with 1 stone.